The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Transition Pathways to the Future. Today's webinar will be presented from 11 to 1 Central Time. Audio for the webinar will be delivered through your computer. If you are unable to hear audio through your computer, you can call in using the phone number listed on the screen. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, then call PACER at 952-838-9000 and say that you need support for the webinar. If you missed a portion of the webinar, it will be archived on the PACER website in 1 to 2 weeks from today. Shortly after the webinar concludes, you will receive an online evaluation. Please take a moment to fill this out as it helps us to improve our webinars in the future. Certificates of attendance will be sent out after we receive your evaluation. Participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but feel free to ask questions using the question box in the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your question into the box and click Send. There will be a questions and answers section at the final portion of the webinar, and we will try to answer your questions, as many of the questions as possible. I'd like to introduce our presenters for today, Carolyn Anderson and Barb Zimke. Carolyn and Barb are PACER parent advocates and parents of children with disabilities. Carolyn Anderson is a senior advocate and grants coordinator at PACER. She is the parent of 2 young adults who graduated with the help of special education programs. Barb Zimke is a parent advocate and project coordinator at PACER. She is a parent of a transition-age youth with developmental disabilities. Barb has served as a parent representative on her local community transition interagency committee and is currently a member of the Minnesota Special Education Advisory Panel. Without further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Barb.
To Carolyn, actually. That's okay. Good morning. We're so glad that you could join us for this new webinar called Transition Pathway to the Future. Transition means planning for life after a student who receives special education services leaves high school. The Individuals with Disability Education Act, or IDEA, includes requirements and special provisions for the move from high school to adulthood for students who are served under special ed. The goal of this webinar is to help parents understand the special education transition process in Minnesota and how to effectively participate, from evaluation through developing an appropriate IEP. When parents can participate from a position of knowledge and understanding, outcomes for the student with disabilities improve. To improve parent knowledge and understanding, this webinar includes defining transition vocabulary, understanding the actual transition sections of the IEP, and gives an introduction to post-secondary adult services. How do we get there from here? Starting with a goal or the end in mind, the IEP team needs to kind of plan backwards from the student's current levels to determine what the student needs. Just a moment.
Yeah, keep talking. So there's difficulty in the slides are not appearing. They should be appearing in just a moment.
There appears to be difficulty with the slides appearing, but they should in just a moment. Okay, I have heard that we're okay now, so I'm going to start this particular slide again. Starting with a goal or end in mind, the IEP team needs to plan backwards from the student's current levels to determine what the student needs to meet future goals. So on this slide, the here and the there means the student's hopes for further education, employment, and living situation and so forth after high school. During transition, every year we will look at what progress has the student made, what's been learned, what still needs to be done. In Minnesota, transition begins during the 9th grade. How long the process will last depends on age and grade and special needs. Most students will graduate with a diploma following the 12th grade. However, if the IEP team determines that the student will not meet the district's graduation requirements or perhaps not complete his or her measurable annual goals, the IEP team must develop a new IEP for the next school year. The student may also need to work longer to pass state graduation requirements. This process may continue until the student ages out, which is the first July 1st after the pupil's 21st birthday. Of course, if you look at this slide, we've got the high expectations, and this slide shows the ideal. But that's where we want to start. We do want to have high expectations and do the planning and work it takes to have the possibility of achieving dreams. At the very least, the goal should be economic self-sufficiency and independent living to the greatest extent possible for the student with a disability. The reality, of course, takes awareness of options, planning, involving new people, making choices without all the information being available, staying flexible, having persistence, asking questions, self-advocacy, and for parents, letting go. It's important to define the dreams and goals. The clearer they are, the more chance of achievement. It takes a dose of reality, too, to find a balance between a student's dreams and the reality or limitations of the disability. In this presentation, in order to be a little bit more concrete, we will use two examples of diverse students. The needs of each student, even with the same diagnosis, are very diverse, but having more concrete examples may help parents understand how to apply the concepts to their own child. So during this webinar, we're going to kind of meet Michael and Carmen. Michael has a specific learning disability. He loves animals and would like a career working with animals. So what's a realistic yet fulfilling long-term goal? What steps are necessary to get there? The steps might include knowledge of possible careers, the courses of studies that might be helpful, such as biology. Perhaps he needs to learn to read better. Knowledge of post-secondary training opportunities in the field, and knowledge of his needs related to his disability and how to access supports after high school. His career options could range from being a veterinarian to a vet tech to a dog groomer to a dog walker. Carmen has a developmental cognitive disability, or DCD as that's called in Minnesota, and dreams of having her own cooking show on TV. What is a realistic yet fulfilling long-term goal for her? What steps are necessary to get there? What parts of that could become a realistic dream for the student, family, and school to work on? What work experiences would be most helpful, enjoyable, fulfilling? Which academic skills would be most important in that field? Perhaps math for grocery shopping, reading for recipes. Most people will, of course, not have their own TV show, but many people, including those with disabilities, might find a job where food or cooking are involved. Another thought is that perhaps these student dreams might be fulfilled outside of a job, as in a hobby. Michael may own a pet, and Carmen may learn to help plan menus and cook at home. There are many ways to accomplish our dreams. We all want certain things. Some we may attain, others not. But too many adults with disabilities sit at home. Parents need to plan ahead for more satisfactory outcomes. So what does the law, IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, require for transition to adulthood? Schools must continue to provide FAPE, a free appropriate public education. But now the outcome of that free appropriate public education is closer, so we can more clearly prepare for further education, employment, and independent living. Transition services must include employment and post-secondary education and training, and independent living if appropriate. Minnesota has a recommended IEP form to help IEP teams cover all the essential components of transition. Your school district's form may look different than the one shown in this presentation, and it can look different, but all the components that we talk about on the form must be somewhere on your district's IEP form as well. As we begin to discuss transition, it's good to remember the purpose of special education, as you can see on the slide. Transition is the time just before the student reaches the adult life stage. The purpose of special education in this quote becomes more real when we actually begin to see what the adult life of this student may be and what he or she wants it to be. There are good reasons for transition planning. We want to help our students achieve their dreams and goals. And research shows that transition planning does increase the probability of graduating with a diploma, having further post-secondary education, and attaining meaningful employment. And now Barb is going to talk about who does this planning.
Well, if you've had an IEP team that's been large already, get ready for it to get bigger in many cases, because during the transition time, we add some key players to your child's IEP team. We're going to talk just a little bit about how that might look. And as you see on the slide, the top one is the student. And the student role is really crucial, especially during transition planning. And it seems so obvious. It's his or her life. It's his or her future. But oftentimes they're not involved to the extent that would be most helpful and effective, because it takes some intentional planning. One thing parents need to know is that at transition age, the school now must invite the student to participate in IEP meetings whenever transition services are going to be discussed or planned. And the school must get their input if they're not going to be at the meeting. We're going to talk a little bit about the transfer of rights on the next slide. But up until the student becomes 18, for sure, the parents still can help make decisions about when and how their child participates in the meeting, but the school does need to invite them, and the school must get their input. Sometimes students' participation, as good as it is to have them involved, can be a challenge. Some students, of course, will be able to participate more than others. Carmen, for instance, as Carolyn described her, may love to go to IEP meetings and talk about her dreams with the group. And maybe Michael, on the other hand, might not want to even admit he has a learning disability and will refuse to participate at all. So it's good to intentionally think through early in the process how students will be involved in the future and start preparing them for that. There's lots of different ways students can be involved, and in today's webinar we can't go into depth about that, but we do have some of the publications that were sent to you prior to the webinar that I wanted to refer you to. There's 3 in particular that would be helpful in this area, and those are the Chart Your Own Future, How Does Your Individualized Education Program Help? And that's for the student. Also for the parent, how you can help your child learn to be a good self-advocate. And then one that's really helpful in this area is the one called IEP, Involving the Student is Important for a Successful Plan. Those 3 can get you started thinking about how you can involve your student in a meaningful way. Student-directed IEPs can be very successful and teach skills that are going to be needed in post-secondary education and employment settings. So it's a great starting point when you're talking about who plans to see the role of the student as really critical. Then family involvement, parents, is also crucial. Sometimes as our kids get older, we think maybe our involvement's not as important, but actually research shows that involved parents make a difference for transition age students. Parents frequently have to become the transition expert. We as parents are the experts on our kids, and really we're going to be the lifelong constant in their life, and so becoming more knowledgeable and involved is really helpful for the whole process. Involvement in the school transition process then will help parents understand options, gain new skills, as well as the student. And in addition, in high school, you'll still have your school staff people that typically come, and the required regular and special education members, and an administrator or a designee from the district will be there. But in addition, you'll probably have a transition specialist, perhaps a work coordinator or a service learning coordinator. Sometimes because of scheduling concerns, you're going to want your guidance counselor to be at a meeting, sometimes a social worker. So school staff may expand as well, and it should be determined by the needs of the student. And parents can have input into who comes to meetings. Then there's the others category, and this is where this really needs to be individually determined. Some of the other people who would have ideas and input regarding the transition time of life may not actually come to the meeting, but could provide written input ahead of time if it was required, or perhaps share information with key people who will be at the meeting. Sometimes for students in transition, like for instance for Carmen, maybe a Meals on Wheels organization, or for Michael, the Animal Humane Society that may be involved in some work experience opportunities or volunteering, could provide input to the team for some planning. And then there's the whole big category of what we are going to refer to as adult service providers. These are the agencies, both private and public, that will be involved in providing services to adults with disabilities once they exit public education. And knowing ahead of time about them and making this backwards plan requires a level of information from them at the planning stage as well. So the team might determine, for instance, that Carmen, who has a county social worker, that the social worker will attend the meeting when they're discussing about future employment and independent living. Perhaps for Michael, a vocational rehabilitation counselor might be involved in helping to determine a plan for that post-secondary education leading to employment. So we'll talk more about the adult agencies ahead on a slide or two. But these meetings at the transition age often do become what we call interagency in scope, and so it's a good idea to begin thinking about who are those other people, perhaps even a sibling who's involved in the child's life, a student peer mentor, anyone who can come to the table, share information, and help in this big planning process. And I referred in that last portion to the transfer of rights, and we just wanted to highlight that briefly here because it's something that's required in the transition requirements of IDEA and in Minnesota. And the parent will receive a notice, and the student will receive a notice. And here's a picture. You probably can't read this on the slide. This is just a picture of what it might look like on your IEP. And this is in that IEP guidebook that PACER has as well that you might want to reference. But it will, in Minnesota, a youth legally becomes an adult at age 18, and we call that the age of majority. And so at this time in special education, the educational rights of the parent are now going to transfer to the student unless the student has a legal guardian, which could be the parents if they've established guardianship. So the student is not going to take on all rights, but they are going to assume special education rights. And this includes the rights to give and deny consent for an IEP, to exit special education, and to use due process procedures. Parents will still maintain the right to see the child's school records, and they'll still be notified of special education meetings. But at least a year before the child is going to turn 18, the school must inform the student and the parent that this transfer of rights will take place. So let's think a little bit more about how this might play out differently for different students. Carmen and her parents might very possibly use the court system to determine legal guardianship, and that is not something that the school would initiate. That would be something that would be a parent responsibility. Well, Michael and most other special education students will not probably have legal guardianship established for him, and so he will become, in essence, the parent as far as special education rights. So for him, now instead of a student-directed process, it's going to be a process where the student has actual authority. And this can be really scary for parents to think about. But the reason why we're bringing it up is if you know about this ahead of time, as early as possible, you can start involving your student, teaching them about the process, teaching about decision-making, and what things to consider. And you can also establish, through cooperation with the student, some other ways to maintain active involvement in the process. For instance, a student might be able to write a letter to the school indicating that they would like you to remain involved in the decision-making process. And there are some other kinds of ways that families have approached this. And if you want additional information, you can give us a call at PACER. There's often a lot of interest in guardianship when these notices come home. Parents often call us and say, does this mean I need to do this? So we have a spring workshop every year at PACER around life planning, which covers guardianship, and other resources as well. So if you have more questions about that, you can be sure to give us a call. Now let's just briefly take a look at adult services. This is a great big topic, and I'm just going to highlight a few areas. When we're talking about adult services, we are talking about what happens after school in general, although some provide some transition services. And there's a few main categories. County services, which are primarily those directed to either students with developmental disabilities or those with severe emotional disabilities. There are county services, there are work-related services through vocational rehabilitation, and there are post-secondary education, accommodation services offered through college disability offices. I'm going to back up just a minute, just to say how do we get to this point? Well, again, going back to that who plans, parents need to say to themselves, who are these important people and players in my child's life? Who can bring knowledge of my child or resources to the table? And then in this IEP planning process, know which agencies may be important in my child's adult life, and do they have anything that might benefit my child now? When I talk to parents, a lot of times they say, but we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know how to find out about it. And we're bringing this up here today so that parents will know it's important to start gathering this information before they need the services, before they've exited special education, so that you can use this backward planning method to lead towards what the outcomes will be when they leave school. For instance, vocational rehabilitation, or VR, which is on the slide, in Minnesota is called Positively Minnesota. You'll see the address on your handout there on the website. VR might be involved earlier than the adult years. Every high school, through a cooperative agreement with the Department of Education and Vocational Rehabilitation Services, has a counselor assigned to the high school who's available to meet with parents and students regarding their services and an application for services. And those counselors can attend IEP meetings that are going to discuss employment plans for students. So it's a great thing if you've got a high school student to ask your case manager about who is our vocational rehabilitation counselor and start gathering information now. Sometimes voc rehab is involved before a student graduates. Usually they don't provide the services, direct services, until after the student exits special education. But they do get involved with some functional vocational assessments and other kinds of employment planning of goals, so it might be something you can access earlier. And then the other one we have here, college disability offices. One thing's really important to note here is that IEPs don't go to college with a student. Once you exit special education, your free appropriate public education ends, and colleges are required under other legislation to make reasonable accommodations and have college disability services offices. And it's a really helpful idea if you've got a child that's heading at all towards community college, regular four-year college, early in their high school years to make a contact with the college disability offices of a nearby college or perhaps one they will attend. Meet with them to find out what kinds of accommodations are typically used. How does the process work? What kind of documentation will you need to access their services? And if there are accommodations that are typically used, you could start to, by planning backwards, start to familiarize the student with that while they're in high school. And they could learn to use those kinds of accommodations that they're going to need later on in life. So this backwards planning applies to the adult service world as well. And I just want to mention that what's really different about adult services is that special education is really like civil right in America. It's mandated for every child who requires it. Adult services are based on eligibility in most cases. They are also based on the availability of funding and can have waiting lists. And most students in special education actually are not going to probably meet eligibility criteria for most of, well, for county services or vocational rehabilitation, but it's something you should check out, and we want you to be aware of it ahead of time and get on those waiting lists if you need to so that the services will be there when your child requires them. There are also some adult services that don't require eligibility that are very important and helpful, and we wanted to just quickly let you know about Centers for Independent Living. There's national legislation that requires those in each state, and in the metro area, for instance, we have Metropolitan Center for Independent Living. They're nonprofit, community-based, non-residential programs that really serve people across the spectrum of disabilities, provide information on housing, transportation, employment, skills training for independent living. Some of them have peer counseling or mentor programs. I know the Metropolitan Center for Independent Living has transition services available as well as adult services. So you can check those out and see what they might offer and start that backwards planning process. There are other disability-specific organizations, and this is really important. When we give a workshop like this, we're talking to parents who have, as Carolyn said, very diverse student needs represented. It's really important if you have a child with autism, for instance, to tap into the resources of the Autism Society. Or if you have a child with a learning disability, the Learning Disabilities Association of Minnesota. If you have a child with a developmental disability, ARC. There's just these disability-specific organizations can give more specific information that might help you in your planning for after school for your individual child. I'm going to turn it back to Carolyn to talk a little bit about some essential skills.
Thanks, Barb. So there are certain essential skills for adulthood, and some of them are listed there on your slide. So we've talked about why we plan and who may help us plan. So now we're going to talk more about what we will plan. Certain skills are essential, and home, school, and other organizations can work together to help students learn these fundamental skills. Some skills will depend on the disability. For example, Carmen may learn to express her strengths and interests, while Michael may learn to acknowledge his disability and learn to ask for the accommodations he needs in order to learn or to work. Then there are certain questions that we need to consider. What do we already know? In addition to the questions above, the questions that you see on your slide, what is the student's status in what we call soft skills, like organizational skills, promptness, punctuality, ability to follow directions, problem solving, critical thinking, logical reasoning, ability to complete tasks independently, ability to establish and maintain social relationships, time management, ability to balance social with study or work time, flexibility, open-mindedness. These are all very important skills for further education and certainly for employment. So they're definitely things that we want to think about. So where do we start? As is true for all of special education, evaluation is the foundation. It identifies needs that will require services for eligible children. Federal law requires that appropriate, measurable post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills must be given. So evaluation will identify the strengths and interests of the child. One thing to note here is that the focus will no longer be so deficit-based or need-based, because as adults we're employed at what we're good at, not what we're bad at. So it's very important. We should have always been looking at strengths, but at this point it's even more important that we identify what the strengths of the student are and, of course, what their interests are. Evaluation will also help us understand what the unique needs are that results from this child's disability. As we said earlier, just the label of a disability does not determine what the unique needs of the individual child are. So this individual evaluation is extremely important to know what the unique needs of this student are. Then the evaluation will also help us know how these needs impact a student's participation and progress in the general curriculum. It will also show what transition needs of the student must be addressed to prepare the student for living, learning, and working. During the 9th grade and beyond, the team needs accurate, comprehensive information to develop an appropriate IEP to help the student meet his or her post-secondary goals. The Minnesota Department of Education recommends that transition evaluation be part of a comprehensive 3-year evaluation during the 9th grade, but it could happen in 7th or 8th grade too. If it is done before the 9th grade, parents in schools and students should look and see if they need any new information in grade 9. If so, that transition part of the evaluation can be done and integrated into the comprehensive 3-year evaluation information and moved forwards into the 9th grade transition IEP. So what evaluation tools will help the IEP team? There can be informal tools such as gathering existing information, such as academic data like grades, previous testing, and observation. Some of the tools should be formal tools where trained personnel, school personnel, conduct standardized criterion referenced assessments. Interviews can also be part of a transition evaluation. Interviews can be with the student and the parents and are often done through a questionnaire on independent living skills and how the child functions in the community and at home. The choice of assessments will be based on a student's age, needs, interests, strengths, preferences. The assessment tools will be related to employment, post-secondary education and training, and when appropriate, independent living skills. It's really important to note, especially the last bullet on this slide, because the information from evaluation will be used to make recommendations for instruction and accommodations, as well as setting goals, both for the short term and the long term. Now, as you'll note on this next slide, we tried to help you understand the flow. Sometimes when you look at an IEP form, it's kind of hard to understand how one thing leads to another. So that's the purpose of this kind of flow chart here with the arrows, to try to help you understand the actual IEP process and how evaluation fits in here as well. So identification in the first part here, identification of strengths, needs, interests, preferences is done through assessment of academic and functional information. And we kind of talked about that already with the evaluation. But there are also other things that come in there, like what kind of grades the student is getting, perhaps things like when Barb was talking about what adult service agencies. All this can be part of this kind of present level where we're starting from. The team uses all of these things, including parent concerns, student input, professional, both school and other agency input, progress that the student is making in regular and special education, and the state and district test results to identify their present level of performance. This is really the first step. Then, and this is that first arrow there, then the IEP will be developed, and it will include long-term post-secondary goals in the areas of education and training, employment, and, if needed, independent living. Even though the student may not know totally what they want to do in the future, it's still important to begin to figure out some long-term goals and what needs and preferences they may have. These are the long-term goals, but they still can change. Once the measurable post-secondary goals are identified, the team asks, what transition services do we need? And that goes to this past the second arrow here. Transition services is actually called a coordinated set of activities in IDEA. So transition services and coordinated set of activities really mean the same thing. And these tell us what's necessary this year to move towards accomplishing the post-secondary goals. So transition services will include the three parts that you see on your screen there. The annual goals to support the academics, employment, and independent living. Finding one's goals through career counseling, exploration, and guidance can also be an annual transition goal. Secondly, you can see there the courses of studies, the classes that the students will take. And finally, other activities such as managing medication by oneself or getting a driver's license. And these other activities may or may not be provided or carried out by the school. What we're going to do now is look at each of these sections in more detail. One thing that I do want to say again, the forms that you see on your slides are taken from the Minnesota Department of Education's recommended IEP forms. So that's what we've put on the screen now. Again, just as a reminder, it may look somewhat different on your school district's form, but the components must all be there. So the present level of academic achievement and functional performance will tell us what are the student's unique needs that result from the disability. How do these needs affect the child's participation and progress in the general curriculum? What are the parents' concerns? And what transition needs of the student must be addressed to prepare the student for living, learning, and working in the community as an adult? Remember on the earlier slide we mentioned here and there? This is the here, where the student is at now. Once we know where here is, we can move on to define where the student wants to go from here. This is his or her there, as mentioned on the earlier slide. You may want to glance ahead on your handout to the next slide to see how this may look on an IEP form. Measurable post-secondary goals will drive, or should drive, the rest of the IEP. The goals should begin with something like after high school. It will use terms such as enrolled in, participate in, work in, live independently, concrete terms. It will include descriptors such as part-time or full-time. To use our student example, Michael would like to attend Augsburg College full-time to learn biology in preparation for a career in working with animals and will live with friends in an apartment. Carmen, on the other hand, plans to attend adult training with a specialty in food preparation and live at home with her parents. I statements are not required, but they're certainly allowed when appropriate. These long-term goals should be the ones stated by the student if the student is able to do so. The key concept here is that these goals are for the student. We want to try to make sure that he or she understands and needs to make the connection between what he or she wants in the future and the work that is required to attain those goals. So you can look at the examples on your slide, and we're going to have more examples as we go along. And as I mentioned, this is how it may look on your school district's form. I have seen other school districts where they separate it. They have the measurable post-secondary goal for education and training, for example, and then underneath that they have the annual goals and so forth. And then on another page they deal with employment, and on another page deal with independent living. And all of those ways are dealing with it just fine. It's just, I want to note that all these need to be someplace on your school district's form. When writing the post-secondary education and training goals, for example, be aware, though, that this can happen in many places. It can be 2- and 4-year colleges, community and technical colleges, certificate programs, apprenticeships, online or distance learning, the Job Corps, AmeriCorps, the military, taking classes rather than full degree programs, vocational training, on-the-job training, day training and habilitation, or what's sometimes called DT&H. Employment, this employment might be paid and be competitive, integrated, or supported, or it might be unpaid, such as a volunteer or in training, or it could be in the military. Independent living includes home living skills, transportation, recreation, and leisure opportunities. As we then move to services to help the student achieve their long-term goals, there are some additional planning considerations which may be helpful. The group of students with disabilities is very, very broad and diverse. What might be appropriate for one student will not be appropriate for the next student, even if the disability label is the same. So to effectively plan for successful outcomes, it helps to know some of the different considerations or possibilities for planning. Barb already talked about a couple of these earlier when we were talking about vocational rehabilitation and county services. But there's other considerations as well. For example, which academic courses a student will take may be more important for some students, while involving persons from those adult service organizations like vocational rehabilitation may be more important for planning for other students. Some of these considerations are listed on the slide. So, for example, if the IEP was planning for Michael, who has a learning disability, it would be important to know that he expects to graduate with his class on time. He expects to pass the GRAD, G-R-A-D, test with accommodations and earn the number of credits his district requires. The team expects him to accomplish his IEP goals, including those for transition. Michael will take all regular education classes, and he receives limited special education support in his study hall. He will probably not be eligible for county or vocational rehabilitation services. It's estimated that 80% of students who receive special education will not be eligible for vocational rehabilitation. For Carmen, who has a developmental cognitive disability, the considerations might be quite different and also important for planning. The team knows that she takes the alternative MTAS state assessments. She will probably continue special education services in a transition program after the 12th grade. She attends all special education classes except for one regular class where her curriculum is modified. She will likely be eligible for county developmental disability services and vocational rehabilitation services. So having this discussion and talking about these issues can be helpful for planning the transition IEP. After identifying the present levels and defining post-secondary goals, the student should ask, what services and activities do I need to achieve those long-term goals? I do want to note here the term service. The term service, as used on the IEP, does not necessarily mean a service provided by the school or an agency. In this case, now that we're in transition, it could mean something that the family provides. Service areas include those that are on the slide. Instructions, which could be specialized, like in special education, or regular education, career or technical education, or in an arrangement to go elsewhere to learn a particular skill, such as typing or the use of assistive technology or public transportation. All of those can be listed under instruction. Related services, which are not all necessarily provided by the school, could include attendance services, rehabilitation counseling, social work service, therapeutic recreation. This can also include school-provided special education-related services, such as transportation needed to accomplish goals and access the curriculum. Next area is community participation. This could include after-school jobs, using the public library, participation in community and recreation activities, the bus schedule reading or practice, preparation for driver's permit, and road tests. The next area, development of employment and other post-secondary goals, this can include participation in work experience programs, assistance to write resumes, practice interviews, travel planning, or money management. The other category can include daily living skills and provision of a functional vocational assessment. Just a note on a functional vocational assessment. This assessment determines a student's strengths, abilities, and needs in an actual or simulated work setting or in a real work sample experience. This area may be appropriate for Carmen. This is how this section may look on an IEP. Again, this is from the Minnesota Department of Education's form. We know that it's a little hard to read on your slide, so in one of the downloadable materials that you received with this webinar is a handout. It's part of some training that the Minnesota Department of Education has done to give some more concrete examples about how this section of an IEP might look. In the first column, you see services, and these are the services that I just defined on the last slide. In the second column, the team will list activities needed this year. Now, remember that this is an annual part of the IEP now. So in the second column, the team will list activities needed this year to assist the student in accomplishing his or her post-secondary goals. What are the things that we can do this year to put the student a step closer to accomplishing those goals? The activity can be done in collaboration, like with the agency, students, or family, and it doesn't have to require specialized instruction. You can see some of the examples on your downloadable handout that we gave you. It can include career and counseling, exploration, and guidance. And additional opportunities can be provided that will help the student develop a clearer vision for what they want to do after high school. One of the tips that the Minnesota Department of Education gives in this area is that if the activity is printed in bold, then that would lead to an annual goal in another part of the IEP. In the last column, it lists who will provide the service. It could be a parent or a student, or it could be the school. There's some examples on that handout again. Another example might be if the service is instruction 2 and the activity is improve reading skills. Perhaps in this case it would probably be special education through an IEP goal. So that would read, if you were reading across, it would be instruction 2, improve reading skills, that is provided by special education through an IEP goal. Another example, if you're reading across, could be under community participation. So it could be community participation, the activity being community recreation, and the agency responsible might be the family. Maybe the family will look into joining the YMCA, and in this case there would be no IEP goal for that. So Barb has something to add here.
I just wanted to add a little tip to parents. One of the confusing elements for a lot of families is that perhaps if their child was in early childhood special education and started out in the early years with an individual family service plan, you were familiar with services other than academic kinds of school and educational-based needs being a part of the plan, and that it was kind of a cross-environment. Are really not going to be the school responsibility unless that's clearly spelled out. And on this nice chart, there is a section for putting in the agency providing the service on the IEP, but you may or may not get full information about that on the proposed IEP that you receive. And I just encourage families, if there's any question about who's doing what, to just make that clear with the IEP team. Many, many families work on all sorts of skills with their children and do provide community experiences, and it's very appropriate to record that so that everyone's on the same page about how these needs will be addressed. But it is very important to be clear. If you think the school is going to be helping your student, for instance, access post-secondary education options, and the school thinks you're taking your child to do it, it can create a gap. So I encourage you to feel very free to ask questions and to get really clear on who's providing what and whose responsibility it is. And then if it's part of the IEP and the responsibility can't be met by the indicated agency, the team does need to meet to determine another way to meet that need.
Thank you, Barb. Very helpful. The next, we're going to talk about the next area, courses of study. Some of the transition services will be provided in classes taken by the student. And again, you might want to just glance ahead to your next slide where you can see how this might look on your district's IEP. So the team will ask, what classes will the student take to help achieve long-term goals? And it's important not just to think about the class as a whole, but what is taught there that relates to a long-range plan. And it could be maybe research is done there, or group planning, or using the internet, or taking field trips, or some particular social skills that are needed to work in a small group. So there can be all kinds of considerations there. We do want to note that we understand that this can certainly be a challenge for an IEP team. Sometimes high school scheduling processes are not on the same time frame as IEP meetings and planning. There's electives versus required classes. Sometimes placement in one class may help determine the future classes, but it's not yet known how the student will do in the first class. So there certainly are challenges here, but it's really important to discuss these courses of study and have them listed on the IEP. Now, the courses of study can include regular education classes as well as special education classes, and include other activities such as work-based learning or service learning, technical classes. The Minnesota Department of Education recommends that at least 2 years of classes be on this form so that you're really looking ahead. The classes should have a direct relationship between high school and measurable post-secondary goals. Using our student's example, the team may ask, which courses will Michael need in order to be accepted at Augsburg College? Or where might Carmen get some food service experience? The chart includes both classes already taken and long-range plan for future coursework. Note the anticipated graduation on the bottom of the form. It's very important to plan ahead. How many credits are required at this school? Which courses are required for graduation? And then annually you can look and see where does your student end up on these. Are they short on some classes? We don't want any surprises, not the student or the parents or the team. This time of year at Pacer we get a lot of calls where this planning has just not taken the way that it should, and we've got some surprises and students are credits short and so forth. So using this form effectively can help in many ways. Barb?
And I think it's important, too, as we've been talking about Michael and Carmen, there are different routes to graduation, and discussing that annually about how long we think the student will be in school, if they will need education past 12th grade. Those discussions should take place annually because children's needs change, and we want to know ahead of time how much time we think we have left for the student to be working on these particular goals that lead to the measurable post-secondary success.
Thanks, Barb. Then we get to the goals and objectives. And if you think back to that chart, we've had, these are part of the transition services, the annual goals. So the IEP will always include a statement of measurable annual goals. We've had the measurable post-secondary goals, but those are the long-term ones. And now we're talking about the annual goals. These are the steps to achieve the long-term goals and dreams. Ideally, the transition services page information will guide what should be included in the annual goals. According to the Minnesota Department of Education, goals should reflect the need that has been found through assessment. They should indicate what the student is expected to be able to do at the end of this IEP year. The goals will describe a behavior, activity, skill, response, or set of responses in observable, measurable terms so that progress can be measured. The goals should actually guide instruction, and they should align with the general curriculum through the 12th grade. Each goal will have objectives, and these need to include an observable student behavior, a condition under which the behavior will occur, and a way to measure progress. Some goals will be academic. Like Barb said earlier, there is some change, though, when we get to the transition IEP. So we might see more lifetime skills for the team to look at more lifetime skills now, such as learning to balance a checkbook, cook meals, be safe, making doctor's and dentist's appointments, refilling prescriptions, taking a bus, reading a bus schedule, earning a driver's license, find bowling alleys in the Yellow Pages or Internet. Some students may need to learn to use assistive technology, such as a watch with an alarm as a reminder it's time for a task, or how to use accommodations, such as a list of steps to remind them of what to do next. Some students may need to be taught social skills in a structured way, such as role modeling, social stories, repeated practice, to master basic social skills that's expected in adult settings. There are some examples on this and the following slides to try to pull all these areas together, the measurable post-secondary goal, the transition services, and annual goals, and coursework. So we're just going to use these examples to try to help us how to apply this in real-life situations. So for Michael, to prepare for higher education, which is his post-secondary goal, he may need transition services such as improved reading skills, learning how to access the disability office at a college, learning what the college requires to document the disability, learning what is required for admission at the college. His annual goals could include such things as acknowledging and describing his disability, developing self-advocacy skills, improving his study skills, improving reading skills, managing a schedule, accessing support services, using assistive technology. Now, these can certainly vary from year to year. Every year at the end of the IEP year, we want to look and see, well, what has been accomplished? Perhaps this year Michael did learn to manage a schedule, and so then, of course, that's not necessary on the next one, but perhaps there's a different step that he needs to take in order to be a step closer to accomplishing his post-secondary goal. His courses of study will be selecting appropriate courses in high school so that he can achieve the goal of attending Augsburg. So, for example, he'll need to probably pass high school biology. He may need to improve his reading skills. And the outcome in each of these cases will be observable. As this example shows, the more specific the long-term goal, the more it can guide services.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about Carmen and her post-secondary educational example. I just want to mention at the outset, I think that for those of us who are parents of children who have developmental disabilities particularly, oftentimes our frame of reference for what would be out there in the future is more limited because our child's future might look very different than the kind of transition to adulthood that we ourselves have experienced. So it's more important when we're trying to plan ahead to get a glimpse of what that might look like. And I'm mentioning that here because we use a post-secondary goal of Carmen attending an adult area training program. And perhaps you're a parent and you think, I have no idea what an area adult training program looks like because you have no experience with that. So it's very important for children who are probably going to need a different kind of configuration of adult services, for families to ask ahead of time what resources are available and to schedule some tours and to actually go see what it is we're talking about. Because if we're going to plan now towards Carmen going into the adult area training program, we need to know what skills will she need there to be successful. How does that look? And you know, we're talking here about a transition service then to locate adapted kitchen equipment. Well, that's because we know that in this adult area training program, they have a food services program where they can use adapted kitchen equipment. So this would prepare her to be successful. And then her annual goal is that given instruction now, she'll learn how to use 5 new pieces of adapted kitchen equipment effectively by the end of the IEP period. And we can observe that. We'll know that she's mastered that. And coursework for Carmen might include intentional work experience program carried out at a community food service provider, again, linked to what it will look like when she graduates and is attending the adult area training program. I think she could have all sorts of other transition services. These are just a few examples. For instance, she might need to continue to work on her reading skills. because she's going to need to be able to read cookbooks. She may need to work on learning to be on time, learning time to be able to be there on time, learning to use appropriate assistive technology. She's going to also perhaps want some goals around developing self-advocacy skills so that she can continue to learn how to ask for the help that she needs to improve her reading skills. Her courses of study could be work experience in high school, as well as other courses that relate to her development of skills and experience. So these are just some ideas to get you thinking about really connecting to that long-range experience, which you can only do if you have an idea of what's entailed in that experience.
So that was a couple of post-secondary examples, and now we're going to look at a couple of employment examples. So for Michael, after high school, he wants to work in a career that involves animals. So that's his long-term goal, and that's the one he identified way back in his evaluation. So one of the transition services he needs, because here we're talking about careers, is he will need to know how to write a resume. And his annual goal, which could be, again, we're talking about careers here. Given research opportunities, I will report 4 possible careers that involve animals to my case manager by the end of the IEP term. And coursework, of course, this fits right into his interest, the essential biology. So again, this shows how these areas all flow together. And for Carmen's
employment example then is that after high school, she will work in a career that involves food, and that could even be specified more as time goes by. Her transition service, in this case, one of them will be that she will learn to be punctual. One of her annual goals would be given instruction. I will learn to read a digital clock with 90% accuracy by whatever the end of the IEP year is. And then her coursework on that grid would have a box filled in for some food service work experience that the team would plan.
And then we've got a couple of independent living examples. Now, I know sometimes for a student like Michael with a learning disability, the team may determine that this area is not appropriate, but again, looking at his evaluation, his transition evaluation, if there are some areas on there where Michael has needs, then he would be, the team would need to look at the independent living area. So in this case, we're saying that Michael's transition evaluation did show some needs in this area. And so for his post-secondary goal, it's that he wants to live in an apartment in the community with friends, which a lot of kids would want to do. But because of Michael's learning disability, and here's the link to his disability and therefore the IEP, is that because of his learning disability, he has areas in the need of math. And so in order to live independently, of course, we have to pay rent, we might need to buy insurance, we have to budget and so forth. So transition service for Michael might be to improve his functional math skills. Another thing is that he might need to learn how to cook, and otherwise, how do you live independently? So his annual goal here is given instruction. I will be able to plan 5 meals, shop for the ingredients, and cook them as demonstrated to my teacher. Now, of course, you can see that there might be some math skills and some reading skills that are involved in actually carrying out this goal. And perhaps the school has a course called Living Today, something like that, that will help Michael gain some of these skills. And we're assuming that this Living Today is a regular education course. But in this case, it would help him work towards that independent living goal.
This is Barb, and I'm just going to mention here again that the independent living area is not required for all students in transition for the team to address, and that will be a team decision about whether or not that's needed and appropriate. For Carmen, the decision was that it is appropriate. And another thought to add here, just in a realistic kind of way, is it's very challenging within the high school structure for students and for teams to plan for students who require both mainstream academic coursework and addressing independent living skills. Oftentimes the way schools are structured, there's a little bit of an either-or. You know, you're either on the academic track or you're in some kind of what we might call a center-based program or designated special education program where independent living skills and functional skills are addressed as part of the overall program curriculum. Where it gets to be very challenging and requires a lot of planning and advanced planning is for students who require both. And there are many students whose transition plans do have both the focus on academics, coursework, and on the need to develop some of these other independent living skills. So it's important to plan early, to get creative, to involve whatever people are necessary who can make changes to typical scheduling structures, and this is where the guidance counselor might be important, or a school administrator, and to talk about really teams should be considering the whole array of services that's available in the high school to all students, but sometimes parents don't know about what some of those programs are. For example, the work experience program. You know, ask about that as your student is entering high school. What do you offer all students in the area of career development, work experience? Are there certain grade levels at which you can enter those programs? Getting this kind of information ahead of time will increase your options, because oftentimes you have to have known about something in order to get on track to participate. And so I'm just adding that here because it's a realistic part of, you know, we're presenting things the way they should be, and that's what we try to do so that everyone has an awareness of the possibilities and the way that this process is intended to go. Then there's the reality of many constraints to make it happen. But really we have found that with good planning, advanced information, good communication, real team involvement, you can get very close to what students need. So going back to Carmen here then, Carmen's going to live at home for 5 years after she gets done with high school. And implied in that is that she's not going to live at home forever. So those 5 years will probably be continued years of preparation for more independent living. The transition service in this case is to improve her functional reading. And sometimes there's a discussion about, you know, do we work on academics in transition? What about 18 to 21-year-old programs? Can we still include this? Yes, we can when it's appropriate for a student. And I always say there's nothing more functional than being able to read, to be able to read in your environment, on your work, you know, experience throughout your life. The annual goal for Carmen then is that given instruction, this is one of her goals, she'll be able to plan 5 meals, shop for ingredients, and cook them as demonstrated to my teacher. And you might be thinking, well, how does that relate to this post-secondary goal? Well, she's not going to live at home forever, and maybe you've been cooking for her if you're the parent, but we want to move her towards more independent living, and this would enable her to move in that direction. And so she's going to, one of her courses of studies will be Adapted Living Today, one of the courses that are available to her and all students at her school. So part of this whole independent living piece is really working on increasing the level of independence, decreasing the need for supports and cues and the variety of things that a student might have been receiving, and learning to use adaptations that will continue to be useful for independent living beyond school.
And now we're kind of moving on to the next piece, which is the IEP checklist. Because all states must implement the requirements of IDEA, the United States Department of Education established 20 indicators that each state is required to address in evaluating their efforts to comply with the law. So of these 20, there's one called Indicator 13, which measures the percentage of youth age 16 and above with an IEP that includes coordinated, measurable annual goals and transition services that will reasonably enable the student to meet post-secondary goals. So to be in compliance with this indicator, the team must be able to answer yes to 8 questions. Now we gave you a handout of Indicator 13 that has those 8 questions on it. And the way that's supposed to work is that once the team has met and the team has developed an IEP, before that IEP is actually sent to the parents or the student if they're over 18 for consent or denial of consent, the team should ask themselves those 13 questions before it's sent to the parents. So this is a really important step, and so we really want parents to be aware of what questions are and that they should be answered before they even get there. So we could take a look at what those questions are. If you want to look at your handout, but if you don't have that handy, I can just say what they are. So the first question is there a measurable post-secondary goal that covers education or training, employment, and as-needed independent living? So this is that one section of the IEP that we talked about. Also then, are these post-secondary goals updated annually? These are long-term goals, but kids grow up, they change, and so they might need to be updated annually. Next, is there evidence that the measurable goals were based on age-appropriate transition assessment? So this is part of that evaluation that we talked about earlier. Next, are there transition services in the IEP that will reasonably enable the student to meet his or her post-secondary goals? Remember, we talked about these transition services are the annual things. Is this a step closer? Parents can ask themselves, is this a step closer that my child may actually accomplish this measurable post-secondary goal? The next question is, do the transition services include courses of study that will reasonably enable the student to meet his or her post-secondary goals? And we talked quite a bit about these courses of study, or the classes that a student will take, which also includes work study and those kinds of things as well, work experience. Next are there annual goals related to the student's transition services needs? Again, is this a step closer to helping my child accomplishing their long-term goals? And next, is there evidence that the student was invited to the IEP meeting where transition services were discussed? Remember, we said the students must be invited, and we certainly want to encourage their participation. And if they don't attend, how was their input included anyway? That is an important question to ask. And finally, if appropriate, is there evidence that a representative of any participating agency, and this would be like the county or vocational rehabilitation or others, was invited to the team meeting with the prior consent of the parent or student? So again, when these questions have been answered with a yes, then this transition IEP will be submitted to the parents and student for consent or denial of consent. IEP teams may use Minnesota's due process procedures to resolve any differences that come up through this. And if this presentation does not cover what the procedures are for resolving any differences, but if this is a question that you have, feel free to call PACER or check our dispute resolution information on PACER's website. We've just recently expanded those materials, so it might be something that you'd like to check out. Just wait with us a minute. The slide isn't changing. Oh, now it did. Okay. 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 Thanks. Always a few technical things with webinars. So now all of this leads to, down the line somewhere, at 18, 21, somewhere in there, graduation. To receive a high school diploma in Minnesota, a student must meet course requirements and testing requirements. The assessments required for graduation in Minnesota measure reading, writing, and math proficiency of the high school students. By requiring graduates to reach a specified level on these assessments, Minnesota is making sure that students are on track to have the skills and knowledge needed for post-secondary or for post-high school success. So we have something in Minnesota called Graduation Required Assessments for Diploma, and they shorten that for GRAD. Again, that means Graduation Required Assessments for Diploma. The GRAD measures reading, writing, and math proficiency. Students in the class of 2010, which is the class that's graduating now, are the first ones required to pass these GRAD tests to graduate from a public school in Minnesota. These tests can be passed in several ways. They can earn a proficient score on the MCA2, or they can earn a passing score on the GRAD portion of the MCA2, or they can receive a pass individual based on an IEP team decision. Another way to pass or to assess students with severe cognitive disabilities is with a test called the MTAS, M-T-A-S. In the spring of 2011, Minnesota is planning for a third alternative, and you can be watching PACER information for more information on that new option. Now, there's something important here to look at as well, not just the tests, but accommodations and modifications. Accommodations, but not modifications, are allowed the first time a student takes the GRAD test. This establishes a baseline skill level for the student. After the initial test, the IEP team could set a lower passing score, which might be appropriate for this individual student. The students may retake any of these tests twice each year and 3 times in grade 12. It's important to note the difference between graduation and taking a diploma. If a student will continue with transition services after the 12th grade, the school district may allow them to participate in graduation ceremonies, but they will not take the diploma until the school transition program is done. But eventually, students will graduate. Upon graduation or at the end of special education services and with satisfactory achievement of all instructional goals, a student with disabilities in special education will receive a high school diploma identical to the diploma given to general education students. The student's record or transcript will show if the student passed graduation standards, and it will say pass whether they passed at the state or individual level. It won't say that they passed at an individual. It will simply say pass, or it will say not pass if the student did not pass even at the individual level. As mentioned earlier, the U.S. Department of Education established 20 indicators that each state is required to address in evaluating their efforts to comply with the law. One of the indicators, number 14, looks at the outcome of special education for a student who has graduated while having an IEP. Your school district will soon survey some of the students a year after graduation to see if the student is enrolled in post-secondary education or is employed. The Minnesota Department of Education is currently developing this survey to give outcome data for this indicator 14, which states the percent of youth who are no longer in secondary school and had IEPs in effect at the time they left school. The transition years are preparation for life after high school. We all need to know the outcomes of that preparation. Remember what we said was the purpose of special education? It's to prepare students to live independent and productive lives. So if you want your child to receive a if you or your child receive a survey after graduation, we recommend that you please participate by filling it out and returning it. In summary, transition is the movement of a student who has an IEP from high school to adult life. The outcome of the special education transition process will be more successful if parents can participate as informed IEP team members. We hope that after this presentation you are more familiar with the transition-related terms, the transition sections of the IEP, adult services, and how to effectively participate in the transition process to improve the likelihood that your student will achieve his or her goals and dreams.
I just want to mention at this point we're going to be transitioning into questions and answers, and some of you have been emailing your questions. We'd appreciate it if you have a question that came up, if you would do that. One question, very simple one that came in just recently, was if we could please repeat what GRAD stands for, G-R-A-D, and that's the Graduation Required Assessments for Diploma. And some of you who may have older students might remember the basic skills tests, and then there were the MCAs. Now the portion required for diploma is the GRAD required assessments for diploma. There are also the MCAs, which are the accountability tests. So there's a little bit of a distinction between what their purpose is, but the ones that are required in order to meet requirements to graduate are called the GRAD, G-R-A-D. And I'm just going to mention, too, that what Carolyn said about the third test, for those of you, especially those of you who are educators, but also for parents, just for a level of awareness, that's going to be the MCA modified, which is a whole different assessment, and people have been aware that it may be offered, and Minnesota is going to now offer that assessment, which may be appropriate for students with learning disabilities. There's eligibility criteria for that, and we will be developing some more training materials on that as well. But this would be a great time to answer a few of your questions. Someone just asked, when are we having the guardianship seminar? Because this is a webinar that's going to be archived, I just want to say here, for those of you who may be listening to this webinar not live, every spring we have the workshops in May generally. So whenever you listen to this, you can know that that's coming. This year, I don't have the dates right here in front of me, but if you go to the pacer.org website and click on the workshop link, the dates are there. It's later in May, like the 19th, I believe, but you can register online, or you can just give Pacer a call at the main number, and someone can help you with registration for that. And then, Carolyn, I'm going to ask a question that came in about the evaluation process. If you have a student, someone wants to know who was first evaluated for transition assessments in the 7th grade, because schools can incorporate that into their 3-year reevaluation. They want to have that done before 9th grade, so they might have done it in 7th grade. Now the student's getting ready to go into high school. Can they get more assessment, because it seems like maybe that's old now? How does that work? How often can you get this information?
Well, it's really important to remember what the purpose of evaluation is. The question to ask would be, do you have enough information to plan at the current time? Is there information to guide instruction? Is there information, do we know what the student's strengths are? How much has changed in the, let's say, 2 years since the student was last evaluated? So the answer could be yes, we have enough information. Perhaps we can wait till the student is in the 10th grade for the 3-year comprehensive evaluation, and then actually do some more assessment in the transition area. Or the answer could be no, we really can't wait that extra year to update that, because we simply do not have the information about the student's strengths, interests. We don't have the information to write long-term post-secondary goals. We're not really sure what then, if you don't have the long-term post-secondary goals, then how are you going to pick classes? How are you going to know what the annual goals will be, and so forth? So really looking at what the purpose of evaluation is, to get that information about the unique needs of this student, and now in the transition years, where is there here and where is there there, if we're going back to, kind of that first slide. So the student may need more information, or we may need more information through evaluation, and we may not. That's a great question.
Another question, which is another great question, is someone wrote in and said, is the transition meeting a part of the regular IEP meeting? And it's a great question, because it is this new layer that's confusing to families. In general, yes, transition planning is going to be a part of usually the annual review meeting that you have each year. and that would have to happen by 9th grade in Minnesota. There was a change in legislation. It used to be by age 14. Now we say by 9th grade. Transition planning has to be a part of that IEP process. And the school needs to, in their notice, in their meeting notice, where they describe your upcoming meeting, indicate if it's a meeting where transition planning is going to be taking place. So you will get notice of that prior to the IEP meeting. But yes, the transition portion of planning is part of the general IEP meeting. It's just now got another kind of layer to it, and some different portions of the IEP form will now be required, those components that Carolyn spoke about. The same in general is true about evaluation. School districts are encouraged to include transition assessment of these different transition areas as part of the comprehensive or required at least every 3-year reevaluation of a student. It does not have to be a part of that, however. You could have your 3-year reevaluation 1 year and then the next year do the transition assessment portion of that. But all of the things we're talking about today upon this transition age just become incorporated into the IEP team planning process that you're already familiar with. And Carolyn, do we have another question?
Yes, this one came in, and I would like Barb to answer it. A parent wrote that my daughter has a developmental cognitive disability and has an interest in cooking, kind of like our Carmen, and she has strengths in that area, and she would like to have a job in that field when she graduates. She registered for a high school cooking elective class, but the case manager just informed us that because they don't have paraprofessional support in that class, she cannot attend. She does require some supports to participate in this regular ed classroom, but who gets to decide this?
Maybe I want to give this question to Carolyn. This is a really great question because it kind of puts us where, you know, the rubber hits the road about some of these decisions and team decisions. It's always difficult to answer a very specific question without all the information. But in general, it sounds like in this situation, especially because this particular course is related to the students' measurable post-secondary goals in the area of employment, that just the need for supplemental aids and services, which paraprofessional support could come under, just the need for having, you know, some kind of support in the classroom should not keep a student out of an appropriate course selection. And so two things come to my mind. One, it says the case manager informed her that she couldn't be in the class. Well, these courses of study in general are to be part of that IEP team process. So one person doesn't make decisions about a student's IEP without the rest of the team involvement. So one thing this parent could do is ask for an IEP team meeting if the case manager is insistent that the student can't participate in a particular class. So to have an IEP team meeting, but just based on the information that you're giving, a student should have access to the classes that are appropriate, courses of study, especially as they are related specifically to transition assessment. That's one reason why you do it, and that this question indicated that this was an area of strength and interest for the student, and also something required for her to meet her post-secondary goals. So those should be the guiding compass when we're making decisions. I would also throw in here, though, that just because a student requires support in a classroom, like in this cooking class, it doesn't mean that it has to be a paraprofessional providing that support. So sometimes parents are asking the wrong question if they say, well, how do we get a para in there, for instance? Really what we want to say is, what do we need to do in order to provide the kind of support she needs to be able to receive benefit in that class? It could be, for instance, an assigned peer mentor. Maybe there's another student. There could be other kinds of supports put in place for her. So it sounds like you need to go back to the drawing board with your IEP team. And the other thing would be if the school is going to refuse that placement, the parent needs to know to ask for that in writing so that you would have the opportunity to disagree and use one of the dispute resolution processes if more informal process can't resolve that for you.
I do want to note that we're going to continue with this webinar and ask questions as we answer a few more questions. If you do sign off, just be aware that within a short time you'll receive an evaluation survey, and we really encourage you to fill that out. And after we receive those evaluation surveys, then we can also send you a certificate of attendance. I do also want to note that some of the questions that we're getting are very specific and quite detailed, and so if we don't answer your question live here on the webinar, we encourage you to call PACER and ask to talk to an advocate about some of these more specific questions that will take a little bit more background information than we really can deal with now. We did get a question about, is there any transition help at the college level for a student with high-functioning autism? And perhaps Barb and I will both address this. I would start with the disability office at the college or colleges. You probably want to pick more than one. And talk to the people at the disability office and be aware that sometimes it's not called the disability office. Different colleges name that area or department or division or office something different. But you should be able to find it and ask them what supports are typically available for a student with high-functioning autism. And you might want to visit that office, take your child to visit that office and the school as well. Barb has something to add to that.
Another really good question. It allows us to share information that's really important. As Carolyn said, contact that Disability Services office, even if it's not the school you know your child will go to for sure. Even just in our area, Normandale Community College or the University of Minnesota, having that discussion. Many of the schools have great resources around this online. If you just search on the college website for disability services, many of them indicate how the process works, what kinds of accommodations are typically provided. It's a great thing to explore. And the important part, I would say, too, with is there any transition help at the college level, I don't really believe that the colleges in general get involved in the transition process per se from high school to college. What they more likely would do would just to provide you with information ahead of time of what you need to do through the IEP to prepare the student appropriately for the setting they're going to be in, to find out about timelines, to find out about required courses, to find out what you're going to need to be able to document the disability. And I'll just throw in here that what's really different at the college level is that no one is going to initiate anything for you. The student and family would have to disclose that there is a disability. They would have to meet the requirements for documentation. As I said before, IEPs don't continue in college. And the student will have to, in most cases, be able to follow the kind of procedures for informing professors of the need for accommodations. And so, again, what's really important is to build into the IEP in high school how the student will learn the skills, know what to say, understand their disability and what kind of accommodations they need, and be able to access that kind of support. So I think that the short answer, which is now impossible, is that yes, there are probably some accommodations for high-functioning students with Asperger's, just as there are typically would be for students with ADHD or a learning disability. Those are accommodations in testing and sometimes accommodations in the classroom, but it's going to be based on your child's unique needs, and so you want to be aware of how you're going to document those and what those might be ahead of time, and to check with the particular school if you can.
We just received another question, and this is kind of about who is on the IEP team. So we have a student on an IEP and has one special education teacher, in this case teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. But how is it determined who the regular education teacher will be? Because often in middle and high school, students can have up to 8 teachers. So how is it determined which teacher is going to come, and how do you get information from all the others? I think Barb and I will probably both address that. Just in general, again, I think it's really important to go back to, what is the purpose? The purpose of the IEP team meeting is to plan for writing an IEP that is going to address the students' long-term post-secondary goals. So I'd ask the question, who needs to be there? It is part of idea that it does need to be only one regular education teacher. So which regular education teacher might have the most information to provide that's going to be helpful for that student to accomplish the long-term goals? But let's say that the answer is, well, it's these 3 teachers. Then I would really request that we get information, even if it's in writing, or some other way for those other teachers to participate, because in order to help this student accomplish their long-term post-secondary goals, we might need input from a variety of people, not just that required IEP team, which is, again, the parents, the students, a special education teacher, a regular education teacher, and an authorized district representative.
Just to add to that, in general, I would say it usually is just one general education teacher who does come to most meetings, and as Carolyn said, that's the requirement. But every IEP team needs to have a designated, it can be called case manager or IEP manager. Our Minnesota rules actually specify the responsibilities of the case manager. And the case manager needs to make sure that all of the people who instruct the child have access to the information about what adaptations need to be made by that teacher for that student. So although all of the teachers do not attend the meeting, there is a responsibility for the school to share the information. For instance, let's say the math teacher does not come to a meeting, but there are accommodations that that math teacher needs to know about. That needs to be ensured that that happens. Parents can help the process, sometimes by just, personally, emailing those teachers and, maybe highlighting some of those accommodations that are really important, or, arranging for some means of communication that could be helpful between you and that particular teacher. But there is a responsibility for everyone who is teaching your child to know what's in the IEP that is their responsibility to carry out. It's my experience that the most effective IEP team meetings are those that had good pre-planning. It's not just so much what happens at the meeting, it's what happens before the meeting. And I think parents can be helpful in the process by asking questions ahead of time about the agenda and the purpose of the meeting, by providing input about what they're hoping to discuss and which people would be necessary at this particular meeting in light of what the current concerns are. And so, again, as Carolyn mentioned, sometimes it is appropriate to invite particular teachers. If the student's graduation is hinging on being able to pass the math grad and needs, specific help in the area of math, you want to invite the math teacher. And sometimes if you plan it ahead of time, they all don't need to stay the whole meeting. You can have a particular part of the agenda where decisions are made that rely on that teacher's input. So pre-planning is really helpful, and communication with your child's case manager with enough time ahead for people to arrange to have the information that you need or the people that you need at the meeting is really important.
We had another question here, Barb, that has to do with teaching, and it says, my child's case manager is new to this area of the state, and I am teaching at the high school level and doesn't have much information to share with us about transition resources and adult services. So who would be a good person to contact who would have the information that we need?
Great question, and again, a very realistic scenario. Not every teacher can know everything about everything, and I really want to highlight the provision we have in Minnesota that each locality, and it's generally by counties, needs to have what's called a Community Transition Interagency Committee. I know that's a catchy name, but they're referred to as CTICs. And in each county or locality, the schools, counties, other people who are involved in the provision of adult services or transition services meet together and collaborate to identify gaps in service delivery to individuals with disabilities, generally from about, they look at about age 16 to 26. That's just generally. And those groups often, besides identifying gaps, also put together or gather information about all the available resources in a community. Many CTICs, which I'll mention also, the legislation provides for parent membership in those groups, and they're always looking for parents. And if you're the parent of a child, I believe it starts at age 12 that you could actually participate. Getting in on a CTIC is a wonderful way to learn about resources and to give input about how this works for families. But these groups often put together resource directories of the adult providers, the different funding sources, the different public services that are available, and are a wonderful source of information. So for instance, I'm going to just throw out a couple that you could check out. Dakota County has a wonderful resource directory, and many of the things in that directory would apply to other localities as well. It can be accessed just by Googling Dakota County CTIC. The same is true for Hennepin County CTICs. They have resource directories online by different categories of independent living, employment, post-secondary education, with a ton of information. So one way is to access your CTIC. But at the school level itself, I would ask either the case manager, or you could ask your special education director, who is the transition specialist for the district, or a transition coordinator, they're often called. A district may have transition coordinators that don't attend everybody's IEP meetings, but when you need additional information, it's appropriate to ask who would have that information about post-secondary options, for instance, that could attend our meeting to share information, or who could gather information and have that for the team prior to the meeting. So CTICs are a great source. School district personnel who work particularly in transition, and again, you could ask your special education director or a coordinator for information about who that person would be. And then the other really great resource is other parents and parent groups. If you come to workshops that are transition related, like our housing workshops or the workshops specific to transition or post-secondary education, you'll get information there. There's also, as we mentioned in today's training, these disability-specific groups. And I'm thinking for this parent who wanted to know about high-functioning a student with Asperger's post-secondary, there's a support and information group called ANSWER, A-N-S-W-E-R. Again, you can Google that, put ANSWER Minnesota, and you'll get connected with them. Other parents who have experience and are down the road a few years from you are probably your best resource of getting the kinds of information that families really are looking for. So finding ways to connect to those groups is really important as well.
That's really the last question that we received. We do have a couple more, but again, they're quite detailed, and we would encourage those parents to call Pacer Center and ask to talk to an advocate about those more specific questions. So I do want to thank you for joining us on this webinar, and as I said earlier, you'll soon receive an evaluation survey, and please respond because your feedback is very valuable to us and to those funding this webinar. And as I said, the certificates of attendance will be emailed to you after we receive your evaluation. So thank you for attending, and I repeat again, as Barb said earlier, that this webinar will be archived on PACER's website within a couple of weeks. Thanks for joining us.